Hello. Hi, everyone. This is David Drapkin at Psychedelic Today, having a vital psychedelic conversation with our friend Tadeusz Hawrot from Poland, who's in Portugal, and is going to talk about European psychedelic policy, reforms, research, legislations, regulations, everything that is Psychedelica Europa. And the reason we're calling this a vital psychedelic conversation is because this is kind of celebrating our 12-month-long certificate course, Vital, which you can find at Vital Psychedelic Training, that brings together people from all over the world to learn about psychedelics from different disciplines. And we've realized that we're a little bit too American focused and American centric at Psychedelics Today. And we're really wanting to celebrate and learn more about what's happening in the rest of the world. So Europe, there's 500 million people there. So this is one of our steps at really trying to learn and understand some of the depths of what's happening over there. So Tad, thank you for joining us. I've really been looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Yeah, so did I. Great to be here with you, David. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Yeah. And Tad's in Portugal right now. I'm in Israel. I'm an Englishman. So England technically isn't part of Europe. It used to be, but no longer. Um, but yeah, Europe's a very special place. And I thought a nice place to start would be around, before we talk about PAREA, the history of Europe and psychedelics, plant medicines, non-ordinary states of consciousness. And I really didn't know until the last 3, 4 years that there was a long history in Greece, particularly around the Eleusinian mysteries of using plant medicines as a rite of passage in a ceremony. So I don't know, has that ever been something that you've been interested in, Ted, like the history of plant medicines, ceremonies, rites of passage, non-ordinary states of consciousness in Europe?
Mhm. Well, this is not something I'm kind of specializing in, but I've been obviously kind of reading with a lot of interest about things like the Eleusinian mysteries, and actually, um, it's interesting. I mean, they are called obviously mysteries, but especially the last day or the last night is really we don't know much about it except for the fact that people were sometimes coming out on the other end and saying that they are no longer afraid of death, for instance. And these were not just random folks, but educated people. So this was really something that was picking up a lot of interest from the outside. And there are some theories. And there is this interesting book some might heard about, The Immortality Key by Brian Morescu, who speaks about these issues and kind of speculates about whether any psychedelics could be involved. So these are the kind of older times. I want to also say, since we are speaking about Europe and Greece, I think it's a good moment to mention that PAREA, so PAREA stands for the Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance. PAREA is a Greek word, just like psychedelics is a Greek word, and it means it's this kind of cultural phenomenon or thing where people come together. They just spend time well. So it really denotes this idea of togetherness and connectiveness, something that psychedelics also certainly address. And it also means in Greek to party. So many different aspects
Oh,
to this work that we are doing. And then, of course, on top of this, we have Switzerland, Albert Hofmann, and a lot of other critical developments that we've seen in Europe in 20th century, but also there was a paper published lately about some discoveries in the territory of Spain that would indicate some psychedelic rites happening a few thousand years ago. So surely, there's been a presence of psychedelics here in Europe for a long time.
mm. And how are you framing what PAREA is? So when you tell people what you're doing and why it exists,
Mm-hmm.
what is PAREA? Like, what is the mission of what you are trying to accomplish over there?
Mm-hmm. So I think it really, yeah, in a way, depends who I am speaking with. Um, really just kind of take a step back. For me, this work, advocacy work, is all about crafting narratives and then kind of updating them, perfecting them. And these narratives, there are many narratives that in a way I have, which are which depend on, again, on the target audience. But then, of course, there are some core things behind this work and behind PAREA. And I think at the very basic level, the first thing that PAREA achieved and what we are about is about building a community in Europe. PAREA is a membership-based organization, so we are not, individuals, or we are not just a bunch of people who are, having some fancy names, CEOs, whatever. We are really bringing together a lot of already existing organizations. And we have 13 full members, and these bring first of all, EU-wide patient organizations, which are not kind of psychedelic patient organizations. These are groups like Pain Alliance Europe or European Federation of Neurological Associations, because we know that psychedelics, while the dominant narratives about mental health, there is, hopefully there will be more there than just mental health conditions further down the line. And also there is this recognition that if healthcare systems are designed to improve people outcomes, to improve their experiences, quality of life, then they are the source of information. They should be informing healthcare systems and healthcare professionals and so on, what is important for them. So the idea was to have patient organizations at the same table from the very beginning, so that they are part of kind of the development and decision-making process. And one of our organizations that we have is, didn't mention, Global Alliance for Mental Illness Advocacy Networks Europe. So that's the main mental health patient advocacy group. And also PsyPol, Psychedelic Participants Advocacy Network, which is psychedelic specific, and they are kind of the voice of participants. So this is one layer, patient organizations. And this is really the primum movens of our work, meaning that there are these huge unmet needs that these populations are experiencing. We believe that the medical model will be best suited to help the biggest amount of people. Then there are professional organizations and healthcare professionals. So we have as members European Psychiatric Association, European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, then also Association of European Cancer Leagues, bringing in kind of the palliative care angle and comorbidities, European Brain Council, and a few more. And finally, there are all the major European psychedelic associations, Beckley Foundation, Open Foundation, who is organizing ICPR every second year, Mind Foundation, Drug Science, Norscan Mind, which used to be Osman Foundation. So I think I'm mentioning this because it's really important, because we built really a strong legitimacy. It's very different when you go to policymakers and when you say, I represent this and that psychedelic foundation, and when you go and you have patient groups with you, you have, professional scientific organizations with you. We have this representation also. And another thing is that one of the kind of recurring issues in our field and in many other fields and at psychedelic conferences is this issue of echo chambers and kind of preaching to the converted. And it's really important that as early as possible we involve all the groups that will have a kind of a stake in this work, and especially healthcare professionals. We really want to win trust and win buy-in from them as early as possible if we want to think about meaningfully expanding access in the future. So this is the first thing that PAREA is about, and this is a huge advocacy and policy win that we achieved before we even launched this organization officially, it took me more or less 1 year to convince all these groups to join. Psychedelic foundations didn't know me, so they were thinking, who is this guy? What kind of ideas, he has? Obviously, we all have a lot of ideas. Most of them don't materialize. So, it was tricky to kind of gain their engagement. Then patient groups and scientific societies were skeptical about this whole idea of psychedelics, but I've worked with many of them for almost 15 years. So there was a degree of trust and kind of, thinking, kind of hoping that I know what I'm doing. And so they, in the end, agreed to join. Then, if I am to speak a little more about what our main areas of activities are, I would say at the beginning, it's education. Just a couple of months ago, I've seen a webinar announcing results from the Berkeley study on psychedelics, and they were looking also at the importance of education, and one of the findings was that if say a policymaker was familiar with psychedelics or had a personal use or both, such person would be much more kind of prone to support this field, and in the future, in terms of kind of policy decisions, would be much more favorable. So education is really fundamental, especially that we are dealing with decades of bad press and fear-mongering and scheduling as it is now. And my hope is that by letting people know about the recent advancements in science, they will become more and more familiar with this field, and this familiarity will make them more kind of prone to support psychedelic policy developments. And then there is the whole engagement that we have with European Union institutions. This is lobbying, and this is really a very kind of complex area, because there are a lot of institutions, there are countries, and there is not one single place where you can go and do lobbying. It's really it's a bit like making kind of art, and acknowledging that you have to be very persistent and for a long period of time to change the minds of politicians, especially that many of them are conservatives. They are civil servants. There is a kind of inertia, and policies change slow, and there is a reason for that. But yeah, it just takes a lot of time and persistence. So there is much more, obviously, but maybe I'll stop here, and we'll discuss some of the concrete examples of our work, I'm sure, later in the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. You're doing a lot. That's really ambitious, Tad. Really coming at that from so many different angles. And you're mentioning education is a big thing. And I know you've got that partnership with drug science. And for me, drug science is a great British and European organization doing a lot of education around drugs, psychedelics, and pros, cons, harms, risks, but also talking about the war on drugs and how a lot of the stigma that we have in the world comes not from science and data, but from culturally, politically motivated policy. And so, to what extent is PAREA also doing some of that re-education and destigmatizing around, in a sense, the war on drugs, the bans on psychedelic use, and the restrictions around psychedelic research, and that it's not evidence science based? It was more political. Is that something you dip into, or do you kind of want to try and avoid that and let other organizations kind of fight that battle?
Yeah. So first of all, PAREA is looking at the future prescription use of psychedelic therapies within a clinical context. And this was the only way to get support from many non-psychedelic specific organizations, because we are not yet ready for wider discussions. And I think it's important that I try not to kind of conflate the agenda of medical access with, decriminalization, with legalization. This being said, obviously, all these areas are interdependent. And, the one obvious example is that current classification is impacting public health through incarceration, through injustice it creates. Then, of course, it impedes on scientific research. It also distorts the market in that because these drugs are classified as the most kind of dangerous substances, you don't have public funding. So funding is coming from other sources, and it's kind of steering the whole market towards more patents and things like this. So there are these interdependencies. Now, regarding the war on drugs, and PAREA's chair, Professor David Nutt, likes to say that it's the biggest censorship that science has ever seen. I think, when we discuss the mistakes we've made and the counter-revolution, I think we shouldn't be so much focused. Maybe there was nothing so much inherently wrong with that. What was wrong really was the reaction of the authorities, because they were rooted in social injustice, in racial attitudes, which had nothing to do with science. So I'm not so sure. I mean, we should be surely minding not to repeat some mistakes, but I think the mistakes were not in the movement itself, which didn't cause harm. It was opposing violence, wars, and so on. Obviously, the mistakes were done at the level of politicians who banned these substances for all the worst reasons that you can imagine. But yeah, with that, I would say we are not so much involved actively in the whole discussion about drug policies. But to some extent, yes. And actually, in some recommendations we were making, we want the EU to become more active in terms of engaging with the UN and hopefully finally reclassifying these substances.
Great, that sounds awesome. And I wanted to clarify, when we're talking about Europe, your work that you're involved in, is it just EU member states, or does it also involve other countries in Europe that are not members of the EU, and kind of around their regulations and the research happening in those countries?
Yeah, it's an important question that this should be I should have mentioned earlier. In terms of the geographic scope, we are not the kind of EU alliance, but we are European alliance. So we are certainly the ambition is to represent the whole of Europe, and then also Europe can be seen as more kind of traditionally, but also WHO is divided into different subregions, and then there is WHO Euro, and WHO Euro has 53 European countries as members, which are like almost 1 billion people. So it also encompasses Israel. Even I just a month ago I was in Kazakhstan, in Astana, for the WHO regional committee meeting. So Kazakhstan is also part of the WHO Euro. So I would even say that we want to see Europe kind of along the lines of WHO. So looking also kind of cultural and other dimensions, which maybe will stretch the maps a little bit. This being said, with the resources that we have to focus on where we have the biggest, bang for buck, or what is the leading domino that will then knock down all the other dominoes. And this is Brussels. These are the EU institutions. And it's not just Europe, because Brussels have a global influence, because it's a major player in public health by virtue of its economic size. And also because it's a global regulator. The EU is often setting the strictest rules. And then companies often decide to kind of adopt them globally, because it's easier just to set common standards globally. So the EU will be dictating what pesticides cocoa farmers are using in Cameroon, what is the composition of plastics in sneakers for Zara, Nike. They were changing these to make them more EU compliant. The technological firms in California will build their devices to make them EU compliant. Now we have this Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, which will really change internet. It will change the kind of the gatekeepers, how the content moderation, the transparency of algorithms. So there are a lot of laws that go even beyond Europe, but obviously we are looking at the influence in Europe predominantly, and as such, the operating ground for our playground is Brussels and EU institutions, and most of them are based there.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I go back to see my parents in England, I'm going tomorrow. I always get a lot of new pop-ups around cookies and my privacy. And when I'm in America or in
Sorry about
Israel,
that.
that doesn't come up. And yeah, you were just mentioning about the charger. So in Europe, they're going to say that this, the Apple charger has to be universal, so that there's one charger for all phone brands and manufacturers. And so it makes sense that with psychedelics, we're kind of using the same thinking here. In a sense, and particularly we can think about accessibility as well. And I know that's a big part of what you're working on, Tad. So many countries are part of Europe, and there's some very big countries and some very rich countries. There's some very poor and smaller countries as well. And so it's not reasonable to expect that every single country in Europe is going to do all of its own research, is going to be able to have the resources to build out its own, guidelines and protocols and kind of licensing strategies. And so having that universal, unified approach to learning from each other, collaborating, well, that's really the European vision since World War II. So it would be amazing, wouldn't it, if psychedelics could kind of, jump on the back of that kind of process. And I'm just wondering, maybe now, can we move into what is actually happening in Europe, EU level in particular, in Brussels, which for some folks that might not know, particularly Americans, Brussels is the capital of Belgium, I believe, and it's also the capital of the European Parliament. And a lot of the EU organizations and institutions have their headquarters in Brussels. So a lot of the time, that's where you go for lobbying and for policy discussions. So what's happening at the moment at the EU level, Tad, around psychedelic research and psychedelic legislation, regulation?
Yeah, great. Before I go you were touching on some really important topics, such as the added value that the EU could have to help countries to prepare for the rollout. There are so many things that are in common when it comes to psychedelic therapies, ethical guidelines, safety standards, training curricula, and many more. And it only makes sense, if we are speaking about limited resources, it makes so much sense to coordinate this work, to have the EU providing some sort of a shared platform where countries could work on this together. And this is something that PAREA has been calling on from our early days, speaking about some sort of EU task force. Lately, in our policy briefing to European Medicines Agency about multidisciplinary advisory group that could kick off this work. So it's really one of the central themes, and it's not to be taken for granted that something like this will happen, so we really need to kind of continuously push. Now, I think as we speak about European Union, maybe I will provide a bit of a lay of the land in terms of how the EU is structured, and these are just broad strokes, but there are three European Union institutions that hold legislative and executive powers. So we have the European Commission, and the European Commission consists of these, you could call it ministries. It's called DGs, Directorates General. So you have DG Trade, DG Environment, in many of them, and also DG Research and DG Sante. So DG Research would be responsible for disbursing EU funds. They are called framework programs. Current framework program, and they have these 7-year cycles, has more or less 100 billion euros for scientific research in Europe. DG Sante, which is more dealing with public health policies. And then there are EU agencies which are kind of nested under European Commission. So they are responding to the Commission. And there are two relevant agencies for us, especially. One is obviously the European Medicines Agency, which is a regulator. We have a central regulatory approval mechanisms for treatments. And the other agency for now is called EMCDDA. It's based in Lisbon, but basically since January, it will be called EUDA, I think, European Union Drugs Agency. So it's dealing with drug policies. So this is European Union with its agencies. Then there is the European Parliament, which is the only democratically elected institution. It has more or less 700 MEPs, so that's members of the European Parliament. They also have committees, just like such as Health Committee. And by the way, there will be EU elections happening in June next year, new parliament, new commission. And finally, the third major institution is the Council of the EU, which brings together EU member states, of which there are 27. So this is this kind of EU legislative superstructure. But the challenge is that there are all the diverging healthcare systems underneath, because the EU, we have kind of EU treaties and they regulate what are the EU competencies, and health has a limited scope. It still remains in the hands of member states to decide on the healthcare delivery. So this is creating huge access inequities, and maybe we'll speak a little bit about this in a moment. I will now kind of park it. But now, in terms of what's been happening, I think one of the reasons for me to create PAREA was because obviously I've seen so much progress happening in the US, especially in terms of policy, because we are we don't have any shortage of excellent science here. There is a lot happening, kind of academically speaking, but there was no kind of political progress in Europe. So this was one of the reasons, to start moving the needle through this collaboration. And I'm happy to say that since PAREA was created, a lot has happened in the last 1.5 years, which I think a lot of this can be really directly attributed to our work. Like one of the first things we've done, we had a few meetings with this drug agency, and then in March they held this technical expert meeting on psychedelics. In the European Parliament, there is now this MEP action group for the medical use of psychedelics. So this is like an institutional vehicle of support consisting of MEPs that are members. Then there is the and we just had a meeting in November as part of this MEP action group looking at pharmaceutical legislation revision. And then there is the European Medicines Agency. So when I started this work, I wasn't sure which institution could become a champion, but it looks like the EMA is picking the button. They've been very attentive and kind of listening. We already had 4 meetings with their chief medical officer. So my approach is to kind of move strategically and not ask for too much too early. So the first thing we started asking the EMA to do is to do some sort of a meeting, bringing together institutional actors and NGOs and so on. We've asked for this in a couple of meetings and some policy brief. And finally, what we did is that PAREA wrote a couple of letters, and then we got them signed by the European Parliament, 6 or 7 MEPs. So officially, we had nothing to do with this letter, and it went to EMA and to the EU Drugs Agency, asking them to do more. And for them was kind of getting a democratic mandate and to do really more. So they, both agencies replied. And one of the things that the letter was asking indeed is to have the EMA organizing this meeting, and the EMA executive director came back saying that they will organize a multi-stakeholder workshop looking at psychedelics therapies addressing unmet medical needs. This was initially scheduled for the end of this year, but then as we were speaking with EMA, they said they want to really do it properly. Like, this is not a tick-off box, they are really interested in doing a proper meeting, which is why, due to kind of resources, they will organize it in the end in April next year. And there is so I would say that, things are really moving. There's more and more discussion. One other thing that PAREA directly contributed to is that one of the kind of smaller EU institutions, European Economic and Social Committee. They were asked by one of the EU countries to prepare a report on mental health, and this report includes a mention on psychedelics, saying that we recommend that these treatments receive more funding and so on. So it was the first time when there was an institutional recommendation about psychedelics. But one last thing I want to say about attitudes of regulators is that, in a way, the tables have turned in Europe, because at least the EMA is extremely open for this field because they recognize the scarcity of therapeutic options that we now have, and on one hand, and on the other hand, the growing kind of epidemic of mental health conditions. So they indicated several times, for instance, through the commentary in the Lancet, that their door is open, and then there's CMO in one of the calls we had said that he's actually really disappointed that no one is knocking to the door, because since 2019 there was only one developer that went for scientific advice, to EMA to discuss psychedelics. So I think it's interesting, we have kind of engaged regulators, but the problem is now on our side and on the side of major psychedelic companies who, for a number of reasons, prioritize the US markets.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to earn money in America, and the clinical trials are very expensive. But yeah, the market here is massive. And I know in America there's the FDA, and they have their breakthrough therapy designation. Psilocybin's been given that designation twice: major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, MDMA for PTSD, and ketamine Spravato as well. And then in England, there's their MHRA, I think it's called, that's given ketamine for alcohol use disorder with Awaken, and they're actually funding some of the phase 3 research in the National Health Service. So I'm wondering, does Europe have that kind of breakthrough therapy designation, or that kind of official funding mechanism for saying, yes, we'll help fund that research because we want it to get to the clinic, to the hospital sooner. This is really important. Let's make this happen. Any advice you need will be there just to speed up the process of getting the research completed and the kind of medicalization completed.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have this type of schemes to the extent that we see in the US. There is something which is called PRIME scheme, priority medicines, but it's been really mostly geared towards rare diseases. There were only maybe a couple of mental health conditions kind of candidates, drugs candidates that went, and they didn't even, I think, get a special designation. This helps you with scientific advice. This helps you with faster assessment, post kind of approval assessment by the regulator. So we don't have this, and so there's something I wanted to say. There is something more, I think, than just breakthrough designations. What's really important is that we have adequate incentives, to, on one hand, for companies to start developing certain treatments, and on the other hand, to attract them to Europe. And this is also something that, especially in the area of mental health, we haven't been that great with. So yeah, so there is this issue, and obviously companies will look at their bottom lines, and if they know that they will earn the majority in the US, and especially when we are talking about smaller biotechs, then it is what it is.
I've got I think it's a really important question about MDMA assisted therapy, because that is coming down the pipeline probably next year, 2024, like this time next year. In America, at least, it is expected to be FDA approved, medicalized, commercialized, maybe even available in kind of hospitals and health systems. What's the European process like around the commercialization medicalization of MDMA assisted therapy. And I know earlier you said you wanted to kind of come back to talking about equity and access as well. So that literally for me, that is happening really soon. So what's happening now in that discussion about MDMA and who's ready, who's not ready, who's dragging their feet? And yeah, when it comes to equity and access, why is it really important that for you and your work at PAREA, you're pushing this conversation forwards in such a multi-pronged approach through multiple kind of communication channels and organizations? And I know you showed me some graphs before, so I think I love graphs. So I think it'd be really awesome to talk about the equity and access piece. It's really important for getting these treatments accessible and scalable for Europe.
Yeah, this is absolutely central. And before I pull up the graph that I wanted to show, just a quick mention on the MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. When I was starting PAREA, I was kind of assuming that a couple of years after the US approvals, we would see the MAPS therapy in Europe. But the trouble is that MAPS paused their clinical work earlier this year in Europe. They were moving also to phase 3 trials. And for a number of reasons, they decided to prioritize the NDA, new drug approval application. And the commercialization is taking so much resources. So I'm a bit kind of in limbo. We really built a strong momentum in terms of policy, but I honestly don't know when we'll see first approvals. What we are doing is we are engaging with the EMA to understand what would be the lowest common denominator, what they would need based on American data to maybe consider, some conditional authorization or whatever this would be in Europe, so that we do not wait for large stage trials happening in Europe, because we don't know when this could happen, but rather what are the chances that we could have approvals based on American data. The problem is that in the EU, because of kind of more downstream discussions and reimbursement, often payers and health technology assessors require comparative studies which compare your treatment to the best standard of care already existing. But with this, I think it's a good moment for me to show the table, because I think what happens still is that we predominantly in the field focus on the regulatory approvals, and the discussions only start now about reimbursement, and this is so crucial. But approval is just really one of several key elements to the access in the future. And you can see here the pyramid of access. And so the bottom, you have the innovation and development, and the access to medicines is conditional on the development of suitable treatments. So that's a no-brainer. And this development is substantially shaped by how the market incentivizes and how the market rewards innovation. So really fundamental to access is whether effective treatments are developed in the first place. And this, for companies to invest, they need to know that it will be profitable. And this is the trouble we are having with psychedelic field. Big pharma is, for better or worse, are not that interested, because they don't see a business model. And we might argue what it would do if big pharma came in, but I think it's all about trade-offs. And if we had big companies investing 10, 15 years ago, we could very likely save a lot of lives. So what we need is better incentives to attract investment in mental health. And we need also a better package of incentives for smaller developers to come to this field. PAREA is doing a lot of work around this, around pharmaceutical package, but maybe if we have time, I will leave it for later, because we still have a few tiers here to go through. Then there is authorization. So this is, I think, the most straightforward aspect. We are discussing FDA approvals. You just mentioned, David, next year, hopefully around this time, we'll have the first proper psychedelic therapy approved. So that's kind of, I think, there are a lot of discussions about this. But then there is another hurdle, which is more at the national and regional level now. And so authorization in Europe would happen through the European Medicines Agency. But then there is a market placement. And that means basically that it's to the company's discretion to decide which countries in Europe they will file for marketing and reimbursement. So usually companies will pick the biggest, the most wealthy countries in Europe, and you can see what does this do. What it does on this slide. There's these huge access inequities that we see in Europe. You have here time from the approval by EMA to the actual availability for patients in different countries for therapies developed between 2018 or approved between 2018 and 2021. So you have Germany, where patients have to wait 128 days. This is the kind of the fastest, the best performing country, followed by Denmark and Austria, all the wealthy nations. And then on the other side of the spectrum, still in EU, Romania is in the EU, and they are waiting 900 or over 900 days, 2.5 years. And, there is everything in between. And then another metric is how many drugs make it at all to patients. And in the same period, there were 180 or 168 therapies approved at the EU level, out of which in Germany, the majority of them were available, a few months after. And then you have the worst performing countries, small countries like Malta, when you see this 90% variance in availability. So, this is not something that is talked about a lot, but this will be a huge issue, and this will be only compounded by the complexities related to the commercialization of psychedelic therapies. So we are in for a really long, battle in Europe to provide meaningful access, because again, one thing is innovation, and another thing is translating this innovation into routine clinical care and translating this in a timely and equitable manner. So even with the best studies will have the best kind of results and efficacy, it's not enough, at least not in Europe. So coming back to the pyramid, then there are, once there is companies are filing for pricing and reimbursement, then there are discussions with payers, and this is the health technology assessment area, where HTA bodies no longer look only at safety and efficacy, but they look at efficiency. And this is because the premises are that, the idea is to really kind of look at value for money and recognize that countries have limited resources. So they need to do careful kind of calculations before deciding what's added to the basket of covered services and for what price, because you have a decision to make. Maybe you will either provide, an X amount of psychedelic therapies or whatever else, or do an X amount of knee replacements. Sometimes you just, the resources are limited by definition. So they look at value of money, and this happens by looking at the performance of approved therapies in real-world settings, in normal conditions, as opposed to these artificially engineered clinical trials. And so, the question is, to what extent the efficacy will transfer to the real world. And again, psychedelics will be certainly posing a lot of complications here. And then as countries are looking for value for money, they want to understand whether the additional cost of new therapies is proportional to additional benefit. And even if the drug is safe, is effective, and is efficient, it doesn't automatically mean it will be reimbursed, because maybe there will be too many kind of eligible patients, or the price per unit will be too much. So I think what we need, there is a lot of discussions, there's a great work done by Elliot Marseille and his colleagues, the GIPSE. There are a lot of cost modeling already, but there is one more thing which I think cannot be overestimated, and this is how important advocacy is, and how important the push from people with lived experience will be. It's like what we've seen with HIV, they really moved the needle because of an amazing kind of advocacy playbook, and we will really need a lot of pressure coming from people who are affected and they don't have treatments, and they have a right to have the treatments. And one more thing is that we'll need mental health policies to be kind of gradually, they are becoming more and more on par with physical health, but it's still far from being the reality. So PAREA, one of the things we do is supporting kind of overall mental health policies, because there is this saying that rising tides will lift all the boats. And I think that's pretty much the case with kind of the growing importance of mental health. And finally, you have, distribution and supply. There are a lot of shortages in Europe for all kinds of drugs, antibiotics. And of course, with psychedelics here, we are speaking about developing an infrastructure and expertise. And this is no small task. This will require a lot of resources and a lot of time. So I would also say, let's not be disappointed, if psychedelic therapies are approved, and then there is, 1 month, 1 year, 2 years, whatever, and we are still only kind of expanding access slowly. I think this is something we should be really expecting and preparing ourselves towards, rather than being disappointed. It will be a long road to access. And finally, cost. Assuming that these treatments will be reimbursed, will there be reimbursed fully, or there will be some co-payment? What will be the dynamics here, as we see with other treatments? So this is a lot of challenges that we are, that we will face in Europe and to some extent in the US.
That was beautiful graphs, really powerful pyramid, and there's a huge amount of work to do. And I just want to share a little aside. I originally was an economist, and I was specializing in healthcare economics and European economics back in Nottingham University. And I remember learning about the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in Britain that evaluated the kind of affordability and whether the cost benefit ratio for a new drug or treatment was worth it. And so the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in Britain has said no and declined the application of Spravato 3 times. Right. And that's the same, ketamine psychedelic drug that in America has been given FDA fast track therapy, that breakthrough designation. Whereas, for that cost benefit analysis, they didn't feel like it was worth the extra cost of how much Johnson & Johnson is charging for that. And I know when MAPS did their cost benefit analysis of MDMA therapy, I believe it came back as showing that a series of treatments going through the protocol with MDMA would repay itself, the additional costs, after 3 or 4 years of the alternative treatment. So it's, and that I think is the decision we have with psychedelics. They may be more expensive upfront. They may, need more medication and more therapy, more infrastructure development. But because it's often not a lifelong medication that someone is on for the rest of their life, it's just a one-time use for a lot of people. And because the benefits are not just symptom reduction, but actually more thriving and positive symptoms. So it's a different way of just measuring wellness and thriving. So I think that will help the cost benefit analysis for psychedelic medicines. But I'm just interested, are there any cost benefit analyses in Europe right now? And also, are there any psychedelic research studies happening in Europe right now that has EU funding or individual member state government funding? And then we'll bounce through a couple of questions. So feel free to throw questions in the box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there aren't really any proper analysis. I think we still are lacking sufficient data on treatment parameters. We still know, maybe maps already kind of, it's more fleshed out, but in Europe, this will be a little more complex, and it should be in theory built into the clinical trials design, this type of analysis, head-to-head comparative studies. We really need the EU to step up and provide research. This is, again, one of the key things that PAREA is now focusing on, because as we are waiting for approvals, which will happen in, I don't know when, what we can do now is to increase the evidence base, and we can do it also through European funding. There is some national funding in several countries in the EU, in Germany, in the Czech Republic, and a few more, but we haven't really had any proper EU funds going to this area, just some really small projects in a few years ago. So I'm very pleased to kind of informally mention that recently a major project was approved for the EU funding. It's a consortium of around 20 members and 4 countries where there will be clinical sites for a clinical trial, 4-year clinical trial looking at psilocybin for palliative care. I will not kind of disclose more details because the official announcement will be coming in a few weeks, so really soon. But we are extremely excited. I think Jeremy Farrar from Wellcome Trust, he said at some point that Horizon Europe, which is this scheme that will offer funds, he regards this as the cooperative best scientific endeavor in the world, something like this. So it's an extremely prestigious research kind of opportunity, and this will help us to accumulate more evidence, but it will also further destigmatize and legitimize the area of psychedelic therapies. It's a very, again, prestigious kind of scientific program for scientific funding. So yes, there is something coming. And I wanted to add regarding reimbursement. I don't think we should be having a bigger picture. There are, for instance, gene therapies like Zolgensma for SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, which is 2.1 million euro, I think, in the US. Hemophilia, over 3, rare blood disorder, over 3 million. This is like a one-off treatment, and this is curative. And then, another example is, I think we will not have time to go into details, but there are a lot of similarities between stroke and psychedelic therapies, because they are both kind of multimodal therapies which require a multidisciplinary team, a lot of resources. But there are 800,000 strokes happening in US alone every year, 250,000 in Germany, 100,000 in UK. And they are costly therapies. I can tell you that there is an acute care, and then there is a long-term rehabilitation, because people will often need of inpatient and outpatient care, cognitive, psychological, pharmacological, physical therapy. The cost per year per patient in the US is 59,000. I think in the higher income countries, the median is something like 27,000 per year per patient. Now multiply it by the number of cases. The key issue is that stroke was deemed as a significant public health priority. And this happened over a few decades, okay? Because a lot of evidence had to accumulate. But there is money, let alone that there are huge inefficiencies, wastefulness in the healthcare delivery, lack of prioritization. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of healthcare spending goes to only 10% of patients, usually chronic with multimorbidities. So that's just an example. The prescription sales of antidepressants globally annually are worth $50 billion, and the whole mental health market is 100 billion. So I think it's not so much about money, but how much do we value our mental health as compared to physical health, and how much we will be able to show with more data that psychedelics are effective also kind of in the long term.
Thank you. I love that you're sharing so much of the good news that's happening. That the piece you were sharing before, the early announcement, those 4 member states that are collaborating on research is awesome. And that's why these conversations, we're calling them vital psychedelic conversations, because there's just so much that needs to be spoken about, the complexities that need to be resolved and discussed in order for psychedelics to kind of go mainstream, to be accessible, to be part of healthcare systems, not just in the underground, not just in shamanic circles and retreat centers, but actually accessible to real people. And just in the last minute, I want to share a question that was asked: what countries are currently eligible or are doing psychedelic treatment? So I guess that's medicalized psychedelic accessibility in Europe at the moment.
Yeah, so I see a couple of questions. So this one I can tackle first. So again, we do not necessarily have a possibility to have psychedelics as part of the medical healthcare delivery because they haven't been approved by European Medicines Agency or through national procedures. That's another way. Except, of course, esketamine, the Johnson & Johnson treatment. Now, one thing is that this is available. The other is, is it reimbursed? And there are 2 countries, as far as I know, that reimburse this treatment. It's Ireland and Poland. So we will only have more, once drug developers come to Europe to larger trials, and then it's approved by EMA. And regarding the second question, it's the advocacy and the lived beneficial experiences of people are, really central to PAREA.
So the voices of patients, the people that have depression, PTSD, or chronic pain.
Exactly. So it's really critical. Now we don't have capacities to mobilize kind of grassroots types of advocacy. However, there is now a European Citizens Initiative that has just started in Europe, which will aim at collecting 1 million signatures. And there are 3 asks, which are kind of, I was involved in formulating them, which align with PAREA mission, and they are about more research, EU level coordination in terms of building capacities, and rescheduling, kind of EU playing a more active role. So this will be really a grassroots campaign where PAREA, we are supporting it as much as we can, and I think it will be a nice and complementary work to what PAREA is doing.
That was an hour, Tad. We did a good job. There's a lot there that we could go deeper into, and I think it'd be great to have you on the podcast. And once they make those announcements, there's just a lot happening. There really is some good things happening. So thank you for joining us, Tad. Is there anything else you want to tell our watchers and listeners how to find you and PAREA?
Well, I want to thank you, David, for the great work you are doing and for the work that Psychedelics Today is doing. You can find all the details on our website, parea.eu, including my contact details. So feel free to write to me with anything. And thanks to everyone for joining.
Yeah, this was awesome. I would like to let folks know that this is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably within a couple of days. So feel free to rewatch it and tell your friends they can go to psychedelictoday.com and there'll be a video there, or to our YouTube channel as well. All right. Thanks everyone for being here. This was a vital psychedelic conversation with Psychedelic Today and with PAREA, and lots of wonderful things coming out of Europe. Thank you, Tad. You're doing amazing work, and I'm really grateful for you being in the world. Thank you.
Likewise, David, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, and to be continued.
Yeah. God bless everybody. Take care.